The drumbeat to impeach President Biden is growing increasingly louder, with White House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer ratcheting up the rhetoric again, including in the past hour on another network. This is getting very serious. So it's time for some straight talk about this, because the question remains, exactly what might Joe Biden be impeached for? Not broad proclamations about Hunter Biden or James Biden's businesses and what Joe might have or could have or should have known, but what exactly are the high crimes and misdemeanors that have brought us to this point?
The evidence is overwhelming. And the fact that the White House announced today they're creating a war room as opposed to cooperating with our investigation, even members of the moderate wing of our party are realizing this could potentially be the biggest political scandal in my adult lifetime.
Are they really? I mean, moderate Republicans, particularly in vulnerable swing districts, seem far from convinced there's evidence for impeachment, or that impeachment will benefit anyone other than potentially President Biden's reelection campaign.
They are looking to see if there is a connection with Joe Biden. If they reach that point where they can find evidence of a connection, fine. I think the Republicans will move forward with an impeachment inquiry.
Question to me ultimately is whether or not the then vice president was involved in any capacity. And certainly, if he somehow benefited from those deals with Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs and the Chinese, certainly that would be grounds for further investigation and an inquiry. But as I have said, we're not there yet. I am not looking to go down a political quagmire here.
I don't know that we've made the case for a formal impeachment inquiry yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of ifs, right? And yet Comer and House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan, under pressure from the far right, now seem to be insisting that a formal impeachment inquiry is necessary.
Speaker McCarthy has talked about this. Once you actually pass a resolution that says we're in that phase of oversight work, our constitutional duty, then the courts have been much more willing, when you have to go to court to get the information that Mr. Comer talked about we're trying to get, the courts have been much more willing to say, hey, this is a constitutional duty of the House of Representatives, if in fact they're doing impeachment.
Well, whether that's true or not, an impeachment inquiry is not intended to be a fact-finding or fishing expedition. It's supposed to be the process that occurs after evidence has been developed of high crimes and misdemeanors, not to try and hopefully find them. And the problem is that much of what Chairman Comer in particular has been saying recently has little to do with actual concrete evidence. Here's an example, right? Last week, Chairman Comer claimed that President Biden coordinated with the Fulton County DA, Fonnie Willis, and Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, and Special Counsel Jack Smith. Except he's apparently seizing on White House meetings that counterintelligence chief Jay Bratt, who's also a top aide to Special Counsel Jack Smith, had with White House officials in the more than 6 months leading up to Trump's indictment on the Mar-a-Lago's documents case. Bratt was reportedly meeting with those officials on topics of national security, as he would based on what he does. And there's nothing to suggest it was about the Trump criminal cases. But Comer makes the connection anyway.
There should be no reason for that special counsel's office to meet with the White House. The only thing that we can think of is they're coordinating. We believe that the White House coordinated with Alvin Bragg. We believe they're coordinating with Fannie Willis. We believe all of this is coordination because the White House is in panic mode because the House Oversight Committee has found their corruption, the corruption dating back to his years as vice president.
We believe, we hope. Based on what? So let's dig in on the facts and the evidence, on the claims as they stand against President Biden. The evidence. Look, if you show me credible evidence that Joe Biden took bribes, even as vice president years ago, I will be leading the call for his impeachment. Now, there's the recent testimony of Hunter Biden's friend and former business partner, Devon Archer, who was on the board of Ukrainian company Burisma with Hunter. Testimony which showed Joe Biden most likely knew something about his son's business dealings. Biden sent Archer a letter on official stationery which said, quote, I apologize for not getting a chance to talk to you at the luncheon yesterday. I hope I get a chance to see you again soon with Hunter. At the end, it said, P.S. Happy you guys are together. He knows they're in business together, an apparent reference to an investment firm Archer and Hunter co-founded. It does seem clear that then Vice President Biden did know something about his businesses, even though he's repeatedly denied knowing anything. As I've said in the past, the transcript of Devon Archer's testimony supports two things. One, it sure seems then Vice President Biden talked to his son in some ways about his businesses, even though he's repeatedly denied doing so. But two, there's still no credible evidence of any corruption by Joe Biden or any direct involvement in Hunter's businesses. Archer testified that Hunter put his father on speakerphone during business meetings, and that those conversations would entail, quote, where are you, how's the weather, how's the fishing, how's the whatever it may be, but it's very, casual conversations not about cap tables or financials or anything like that. Yes, it's clear Hunter Biden was selling his supposed access, influence peddling, and it was powerful for Hunter.
I could definitively say at particular dinners or meetings, he knew there were business associates. To be, completely clear on the calls, I don't know if it was an orchestrated call in or not. It certainly was powerful, though, because, if you're sitting with a foreign business person and you hear the vice president's voice, that's prize enough. I mean, that's pretty impactful stuff for anyone.
That's Devon Archer. But here's the most important question that Archer was asked about during his closed-door testimony. Did you have any knowledge of Joe Biden having any involvement with Burisma? Archer replied, no, not direct, no. But it does seem President Biden was probably not being totally forthcoming when he has repeatedly said this.
How many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings. I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses.
Do you stand by your statement that you did not discuss any of your son's overseas business dealings?
Yes, I stand by that.
Initially, it seemed this was how the Oversight Committee hoped to bring down President Biden, by saying he lied about that. But it appears that they quickly realized that a potential lie to the public or the media isn't nearly enough for an impeachment inquiry, and it's not an impeachment standard that any president can live by. So now they've kind of moved the goalposts to suggest that if Hunter was trying to sell the Biden name, that effectively should be enough to show corruption on the part of Joe. This comes after the much-hyped FBI investigative reform alleging a bribe to Joe Biden, but that appears to have fizzled. Remember, this is the so-called 1023 form where Mykola Zlochevsky, the CEO of Burisma, it's the Ukrainian energy firm where Hunter Biden served as a consultant for 5 years, by the way, the same firm that Devon Archer was on the board of, apparently told an FBI source that he'd essentially been shaken down by both Hunter and Joe Biden to the tune of $10 million. Quote, costs $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to pay another Biden. And the confidential source told the FBI that Zlochevsky claimed to have many text messages and recordings that show that he was coerced to make such payments. Except then, even the most anti-Biden investigators started backing away from that, even Chairman Comer.
That's what this person says, but again, take that with a grain of salt. I'm not aware that we have verified that those recordings exist.
I can confirm they were listed in the 1023 that the FBI redacted. We don't know if they're legit or not, but we know that the foreign national claims he has them.
And the alleged motivation for these payouts, the source told the FBI informant, it was to ensure the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor named Viktor Shokin, who had supposedly been investigating Burisma. And this is something that Chairman Comer has been on the air today talking about again. The idea being that the firing of Shokin would more or less shut down an investigation into Burisma. And Shokin has recently claimed Hunter Biden was brought on by Burisma to protect from criminal investigations, and that by Vice President Biden threatening to withhold $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees from Ukraine unless Shokin was fired, that, he said, was in and of itself a bribe. Of course, Shokin has changed his story numerous times, and he was the person who was ousted, clearly wasn't happy about it. But again, ousting Shokin was not a Biden-alone decision in 2016. Then Vice President Biden had the full support of the international community and President Obama, even Senate Republicans, to oust Shokin, and not because He was a crusader trying to shut down corruption in Ukraine, but for the exact opposite reason. He was allowing corruption to thrive, including at Burisma, where even Devon Archer testified that Burisma viewed Shokin as an ally, not as a threat. And if Biden was taking secret bribes, would he really be publicly bragging about having done it? Doesn't make a lot of sense.
I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
Hunter Biden did his dad no favors. I've said this before, by using his name to get this consulting position for a potentially corrupt company, while his dad was tasked with cleaning up corruption in that country. It looks really bad. Just hiring Hunter Biden sure seems like an effort at impacting U.S.-Ukraine policy. But as of now, there are no tapes, there are no texts, there's no credibility to the claim made by Zlochevsky, apparently after meeting with Rudy Giuliani during his trip to dig up dirt on Biden in 2019. In fact, Zlochevsky himself has apparently also denied ever speaking to the Bidens in a conversation with an associate of Rudy Giuliani, a transcript of which surfaced during Trump's first impeachment. Zlochevsky saying, quote, "No one from Burisma ever had any contacts with VP Biden or people working for him during Hunter Biden's engagement." So beyond unverified allegations that are seemingly lacking in credibility, allegations that the DOJ during the Trump administration examined and ignored or dismissed. But what about the testimony of the two IRS whistleblowers who claim Hunter Biden referenced being in the presence of his dad, seemingly in an attempt to pressure a Chinese businessman during negotiations? Quote, "I'm sitting here with my father. I'd like to understand why the commitment has not been fulfilled." Again, that's in 2017. He's no longer vice president, but still. Hunter's lawyers claim the text isn't real, but let's assume it is. First, you have to believe Hunter, that his dad was there, and then you have the whistleblowers claiming they were not allowed to pursue this lead because they allege the investigation into Hunter was stymied by political bias within the DOJ in favor of Biden, except Biden wasn't president when those original decisions were being made. Trump was. Trump appointed Bill Barr. He was the Attorney General. And then I get the question, what about Tony Bobulinski, who worked with Hunter and claimed that 10% of the equity in a multi-million-dollar deal with Chinese energy company CEFC went to the big guy, a.k.a. Joe Biden? First, and once again, Biden was not VP by then. But second, there's no indication Joe Biden got a penny of that money. Third, and this is something people don't talk about enough, the Wall Street Journal did a deep dive with all of Bobulinski's material and documents back in 2020 and determined that, quote, "the venture set up in 2017 after Mr. Biden left the vice presidency and before his presidential campaign never received proposed funds from the Chinese company or completed any deals, according to people familiar with the matter. Corporate records reviewed by the Wall Street Journal show no role for Joe Biden." But Chairman Comer's made it clear he's going to treat the Biden family members as Joe Biden, regardless of what evidence does or doesn't exist. The two are essentially one and the same. But now, even some in the kind of the right-leaning media are questioning it more and wondering, well, where's the actual evidence? This was from yesterday morning.
Don't you think that Republicans would be for this if there is more information, if they can get to the bottom, if Comer can get proof and he can get to the bottom of that, then Republicans would be all for it. But they definitely need that proof in order to start an impeachment.
As we were talking about, the people, the Republicans in those districts that Joe Biden won, they've got to be able to say, look, I voted for it because look at this. It shows that there was corruption, actual corruption, not just bank records, but things that show that laws were broken. So far, Comer and company have not been able to put that together.
Right. Most recently, Comer's asking for all documents from the National Archives and Records Administration from Biden's time as VP, requesting unredacted access to a tranche of emails from Biden's vice presidential records, which includes messages related to Ukraine and Burisma sent or received by President Biden or Hunter Biden. Or Hunter. And they say Biden, during his time as vice president, used a pseudonym in emails, documents, and other communications. Except this was a widespread practice among several administrations for the senior officials to use alias accounts to filter out certain messages from lobbyists, etc. Look, if there is actual evidence that Biden did more than potentially lie about knowing more about his son's businesses than he's claimed, if there is proof, something credible, showing Joe Biden actually orchestrating his son's influence peddling, or that he himself was influenced by large payouts to his family members and thus influenced U.S. policymaking, or that he was on the take for any of it, I will be the first to call out Biden's hypocrisy and the need to take action. But if after months of investigations, we're going into potential impeachment inquiry with nothing more than he supposedly lied, then Comer falls far short of anything, coming even close to his hyperbolic pronouncement of, quote unquote, the greatest political scandal of his lifetime. And any impeachment of Biden, not based on credible evidence, will be seen as nothing more than a political stunt and will, in the end, help Joe Biden's reelection campaign, because independent and swing voters will see through it. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.